Hollywood was very brazen, and I almost think what's interesting now is looking at the reactions, is the Hollywood reaction seems incredibly muted. I feel like this has actually engendered a lot more discussion and anger and debate in academia and media, and Hollywood just seems like institutionally completely silent. Partly, I think, because none of them ever, frankly, gave a shit.
Welcome to the Unspeakeasy podcast, the podcast formerly known as The Unspeakable, a place for conversations that are surprising and thought-provoking without being rage-baity or subject to audience capture. Although I'm open to capture. It's the most nuanced podcast in all of podcast land, and I am your host, Meghan Daum. I'm here on the day after Christmas in a rainstorm with my guest, Jacob Savage, who has written arguably the most talked about article of the year, at least when it comes to cultural topics. He got in right under the wire. Normally, I would do a whole separate introduction, as you know, but I'm going to try to get this out to you guys sooner than later without my usual production help. So let's just get into it. Jacob, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
It's been 11 days since your article, The Lost Generation, appeared in Compact magazine. I think it posted on December 15th. There's a lot going on in the piece that we're going to talk about. But I guess the gist of your argument is that since around like 2014, DEI-driven hiring and just kind of cultural norms in elite institutions have narrowed professional pathways for white male millennials disproportionately. And you define this cohort as a lost generation, so shut out from opportunities that their predecessors still occupy and sort of won't get out of. And I think what makes your article different from a lot of what has been said on this topic, and certainly I cover it a lot on this podcast, is that you narrow this down to a millennial phenomenon and you wrap it around your own story. So I want to hear that story from you here. But first, can you tell us what it's been like for you since the article posted? I mean, I don't know what the actual view numbers are, but we're talking tens of millions of tweets and social media posts about the article. Every podcast in town has covered it. So how are you doing?
I'm good. I finally got some sleep the last couple days. It's been kind of wild. I thought the article would be big, but not sort of, capture the internet big, or, the Jacob Savage discourse big.
Yeah.
And on the one, it's very gratifying to sort of see that, and also a little surprising. But it's been, just sort of constant DMs on my Substack and texts, and it's been kind of like a wild little ride. So, and the truth is, I don't want my 15 minutes of fame. I'd rather just not have it in a way and just let stuff speak for itself mostly. But, I'm happy to talk about it.
Well, it kind of, I guess, doesn't work that way because, like, back in the day, someone would just publish an article and there weren't podcasts, and there weren't, like, you would maybe go on NPR show and talk about it if it really caught on.
There have been no invitations from NPR.
Well, I was going to say, the year is young. The year is old. There's always next year. So, I mean, let's, how long have you been thinking about this? I mean, I know you've written a couple other pieces for Compact. You wrote a piece about white men being published in the New Yorker, and the sort of literary trends around that, which is pretty striking. I certainly, I had kind of casually noticed it, but not really quantified it. What made you compelled to just actually spell this all out and say it out loud?
I was surprised that no one had covered it in sort of an actual full way. It seemed like an obvious thing. The genesis of the article was a couple summers ago. This was like summer 2023. I went away with a bunch of my college friends, and we were all together. There were like 7 or 8 of us, and I looked around the room, and no one was like dying or on the street, but there were like 4 of us were underemployed. 3 had been stopped out in various ways. And of all of us, there was just like one person who sort of, if it was 20 years ago, he'd be like, that guy made it, he's a partner at a white shoe law firm. And everyone else had kind of like gotten stuck in some way or another. And for me, I could kind of see like myself as capable of having gotten stuck. But for a lot of these other guys, like I truly didn't. They were the sort of types who would have been, high up on a corporate ladder, like in any other moment, or, high up in a political campaign. And it just kind of struck me that this had affected almost, everyone, within my own demographic, like in some sort of profound way. And I sort of started really thinking about it at that point.
And these were like, I don't want to say high achieving because you're suggesting that they weren't really doing anything, but you went to Princeton. Were these like
these were all
peers
Princeton,
of yours?
These were all Princeton peers. It was specifically a Princeton trip.
And what year did you graduate?
I was 06.
So you were 06. You distill this down to 2014 really kind of being a tipping point. So just kind of by way of tracing your story, what did you do in 06 when you got out of college?
In 06, I graduated college. I went actually to go work on Amy Klobuchar's Senate campaign briefly.
Oh my gosh.
I didn't meet her. She didn't throw anything at me.
Were you like is this like a Veep? Is it true that
No, I like barely,
for Veep?
I saw her one time, like it was, they were already doing sort of weird stuff in politics, but I sort of pretended not to notice. I didn't stick with it. I then went and got I had a fellowship in Jerusalem for a year. I went after that to India for a while, came back, lived in Brooklyn, ran a Ivy League gossip website, wrote a couple screenplays, came out, tutoring, just paying the bills in all sorts of different ways. And came out here in 2011, to try to make it as a screenwriter. That's what I sort of had settled on by that point. And I had seen a lot of people, just a little older than me do perfectly well sort of in that niche. So I assumed as like a young white Jewish man that Hollywood was more than open to me. And I think it was probably for the first couple of years, but then something, really like switched off.
Okay, so the statistics that you have in this piece are really incredible. I want to just run down a few of them. In 2021, new hires at Condé Nast, this is the magazine publisher in New York, were just 25% male and 49% white. Now, the white part is really the salient detail there because Condé Nast is a very female-heavy company. But that's still pretty notable. Of the parent company of the Los Angeles Times and the San Diego Tribune, 39% were male and 31% were white. Now, here we go. NPR, get ready, folks, reported that 78% of new hires were people of color. I believe it. So were you like applying for jobs and people were just saying, we can't hire you? Like you tell stories of like interviewing constantly and like taking tests and, being dragged through the very long, elaborate hiring process only to finally be told, oh, you were never going to be hired in the first place. So walk us through kind of what you were experiencing.
So that was sort of earlier on. What happened after that is it became, this was just not, our manager, I don't think ever put us up for writers' rooms because it was just not going to happen. The way forward for us for many years was like to get various people attached to various projects in the hopes that we would be the creators of a show or another. And so we did that for a while. But it was in some ways, if you think about what the sort of typical path of a TV writer like would have been, is you have a couple of good samples, you get a job sort of very low level. If your samples are that good, maybe after a couple of years, they're like, you know what, like let's let's, gamble on this guy and give him, some money and option the show, and we'll see if it works out. But the lower level jobs just were not, it just wasn't even on the table after, 2016, 2017.
When you were at that Princeton reunion or that weekend with your friends and you noticed this about these guys, did you guys talk about it, or was this just something that you were noticing quietly?
We did talk about it. And, they all sort of acknowledged it to varying degrees of what had happened to them. I don't want to get into it sort of specifically because, they don't necessarily want to be in this article. And, but they all had felt it sort of in a deep way. And like, don't feel that bad for them. Most of them are married to women who make a lot of money or, are doing fine, have kids, like enjoy taking care of their kids. But it's sort of what really was like in any other generation, at least a couple of us would have just been crushing it. And it did not feel that way. And yeah.
And they were married to women who were the breadwinners? Really? Literally?
Some of them were.
Wow.
Yes.
And what kinds of jobs were they doing? Were they doing anything, or were they just like...
No, there were people who had been, in tech or in finance or in politics in various ways. And some of them had sort of, consulting jobs. I don't mean like consultant jobs, but, had kind of like eased out of whatever the grind had been. And others, just were straight unemployed or trying to, find something new, but leaning on their spouses for material support during that time. And some of them had, jobs, but just not the jobs that they thought that they would have.
So you write, I'm going to quote a little bit from this because I think it helps frame this for people. This is not a story about all white men. So not all men. It's a story about white male millennials in professional America, about those who stayed and who mostly stayed quiet. The same identity a decade apart meant entirely different professional fates. If you were 40 in 2014, born in 1974, beginning your career in the late 90s, you were already established. If you were 30 in 2014, you hit the wall. Because the mandates to diversify didn't fall on older white men who in many cases still wield enormous power, they landed on us. I mean, I am in the cohort of people who like just slipped in. I was born in 1970. And I think you're absolutely right. And I can tell you that I think certainly a lot of baby boomers, if not all of them, and a lot of Gen Xers, white men, are just terrified that something is going to happen to them and they're not going to be able to retire. They're just trying to get through and not rock the boat. So if that means hiring who they have to hire, saying what they have to say, and just kind of, getting through to retirement so they can put their kids through college, they're going to do that. And it's resulted in a lot of complacency and just lack of risk-taking and speaking up among those cohorts.
No, and I think for sure this, like I got a DM from a pretty well-known showrunner who was like, it wasn't just you guys. I know plenty of Gen X guys who are very good writers who just got frozen out. And I think that's true. But I think if you look at the cohort that got absolutely frozen out were younger white men who hadn't made it yet.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So, and I also think that we should, this is not just something that's happening in the creative arts and in media. I noticed that there was a comment on, I think it was on Mike Pesca's Substack, actually. And, I just spoke with him and he's very sympathetic to what you're saying. Somebody said large companies in my area, Boeing, Microsoft, have metrics by race and gender. The pool of engineers was more male and white Asian, so the discrimination happens in accounting, finance, HR, marketing, etc., to offset the engineering hiring. State and local governments is worse in a very blue state. A friend notes he is the only white male in an accounting department of 20, and the company still talks about the need to balance the hiring. A friend quoted the CFO of Microsoft saying they don't hire white males in finance roles. And this was a while ago now. So this is all anecdotal, but believed by a generation of young men. So this is and was not just an elite media issue and could be one of the reasons for the fall off in college attendance by men.
I think 100%, and I didn't mean in the article to fully limit myself to these industries. I discuss a little bit more. The truth is, these were just the industries that relentlessly cataloged what they were doing, and it made my job much easier to prove. I could talk about, I have, I think, a line about Microsoft or Amazon. I think I may have deleted the Microsoft stuff, but you can get some information from their sort of EE01 reports, but it is very difficult to prove the case. I wanted to prove the case and conclusively in these industries. And, it's what you don't have the sort of new hire breakdowns from these places that they gave you in media or in Hollywood or in academia. But I'm sure that I know that it was happening. And I didn't mean to sort of say that it was not happening. I just think the goal of the piece was to say this is happening. It also could be happening in these other industries, but I don't quite have the goods to, I don't want to make claims that are too wide given the scope.
Right. Well, I mean, it's one of these pieces that it's really good that you have as many statistics as you do, because it's one of these things where you're trying to articulate something that you know is true. It feels true. It's a vibe, but like it's impossible to really quantify. I mean, I think you come as close as you can to quantifying it, but there's always going to be people who say, well, it wasn't that way for me. And,
Right.
I always say, like, the fact that you can so easily think of the exception to the rule that is being described just proves the point that that's the rule. Like, it's the outlying cases that easily come to mind. So, who cares?
No, and I think like I discovered late in the writing, for instance, that like the percent of white men currently in medical school has gone from like 32% to, I think it's now, what the piece didn't reflect that, but I think it's now 18.5% in a decade. And that is not sort of gradual demographic change. That is something like much more interesting and much more crazy happening like at the higher levels of all sorts of things to lead to that outcome. It's not like doctors stop being, also, everyone likes to talk about how these industries like have lost prestige and that's why white men fled them. I don't think people think that medicine is less prestigious than it was a decade ago. It is the same, it's a slog. It was a slog a decade ago, but it had the sheen of, you're a medical doctor, and it still does. But I think that the idea that men abandoned these dying fields, which is one of the critiques that I've been seeing, just doesn't track with what actually was happening in the 2010s. Hollywood was hiring more than it had ever hired. Media, it was spasms of layoffs, but also, it was still expanding in some sense into sort of the internet and new media. Everything wasn't just like a total job loss. Academia had record enrollment. You could argue about, the fact that there were fewer and fewer tenure track jobs, but that has to do with, boomers not retiring more than it has to do with any crisis within academia. And people want to say that was, prestige was already sort of disappearing from these industries. I'm not sure that, the average guy who went into crypto in 2015 thought crypto was a prestige industry. It was just an industry that would have him.
Well, getting back to the medical school thing, though, I mean, I would think that because there are so few white males going into it, there would be a kind of new affirmative action. Like, wouldn't medical schools want more white men in there to offset like all the foreign students and all the women? Has that not happened yet?
I can't speak. Maybe a little bit. I don't know about maybe in a male level because medical schools now are majority female. But no, I don't think. I think the thing about this generally, which I always found at the time very off-putting, is there was no goal. The goal was never, we have now hired this many people and we're done. The goal was never attainable, which led to like a sort of constant, if we can always do better, you can always do better, which makes things very difficult to ever stop.
Good. Yeah.
I feel sort of that we would have been better off as like a cohort if in 2012 everyone had informed us there were quotas in all these industries, and from now on we're going to hire 10% white men in the following, 10, 20 industries. And people could have looked at their chances sort of realistically and said, okay, I'm going to go somewhere else. And I think that's a large part of what Gen Z is doing. They, someone who graduated college in 2020 is not going to have my idea of what Hollywood is like. They're going to have a much more realistic idea of what Hollywood is like for someone who looks like them.
And do you think that the kind of move over to the right and just lack of interest in attending college, I mean, obviously there's many components here, the lack of faith in institutions and all that, but do you think that a lot of these guys are thinking there's no point in going to college, there's no point in like playing ball with like these longstanding norms at all because it's rigged against me?
I can't speak to, I'm sure some people feel that way. I definitely think that in terms of moving to the right, that's an obvious thing where if someone, a group of people promises that your economic interest does not align with their vision of a good society, then maybe you don't want to vote for them. That's not crazy. I think people forgot that there is a group of people, white men also have legitimate economic and social interests in a society and how it's run. And for a decade, we pretended that they didn't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, this sort of, I mean, I hate to use this word, but it's gaslighting, right? Because it was never stated explicitly. And it's sort of like, well, this isn't, you say this is happening, but it's not. I spoke, in preparation for this conversation, I spoke with a couple friends who work in the industry, and one of them, I just sort of took a few notes. I mean, he said, I work in and these are Gen X guys. I work in an industry that made it a mandate to shed white males from the ranks. This is TV. It was on the record. If you were a showrunner, it was very hard to get white males approved by the studio and the network, but a woman or person of color was basically rubber stamped. If you were a white male whose lucrative overall deal was up, your lawyer and your agent were told explicitly that they were no longer extending overall deals to white males. This wasn't done on the down low. It was a town policy.
Yeah, I mean, Hollywood was very brazen, and I almost think what's interesting now is looking at the reactions, is the Hollywood reaction seems incredibly muted. I feel like this has actually engendered a lot more discussion and anger and debate in academia and media. And Hollywood just seems like institutionally completely silent.
Mm-hmm.
Partly, I think, because none of them ever, frankly, gave a shit. like, I think Hollywood can go. I spoke to a showrunner who basically was like, okay, we're back to 2012 rules. Like, don't embarrass us with like an all white male room. But other than that, like, whatever. And, Hollywood, I think, has a greater capacity to pivot than media or academia, and can just sort of pretend that none of this ever happened.
Right. I mean, the other thing I think about Hollywood is that the stakes are so much higher economically than people in journalism or academia. I mean, I've been speaking out about culture war issues actually all my career, but, very intensely for a decade. And I have watched, journalists and authors and people in publishing, come forward and kind of join whatever you want to call like the heterodox ranks. Nobody in Hollywood seems interested in this. In talking about it out loud and, sort of publicly appearing, any of these conversations. And I think that's because there's so much money on the table. Like, if you're a journalist, you're already pretty broke. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. You don't have very far to fall. But if you are like, some kind of A-list movie, talent, or somebody with like a very prestigious job, or like a successful comedian or whoever it is, you're going to toe the line.
I mean, also because there's no other game in town. You can get fired from the New York Times. Like, maybe the New York Post will hire you. It's not like.
But that's a come down. I mean,
no, it's a come down, sure. And I'm not saying that would have been ideal, and I'm sure a lot of people avoided saying what they thought about things. But Hollywood did this. It's not like there was one studio that was like, we're not doing this. We don't care. They all did it. Although I guess you could argue Paramount just decided to go on its island with Yellowstone for a bit, but that was still part of these mandates. So it's interesting that Hollywood seems sort of constitutionally unable to reckon with this in any way.
What do you make of the response you've gotten? I mean, I've noticed that a lot of white guys are kind of doing this thing that I notice women were doing when like women like me started speaking up, about like kind of the excesses of contemporary feminism and Me Too and all of this, and kind of like they would just kind of roll their eyes and say, well, this is not a problem, or like, you're a pick me or something like this. I have seen a lot of white guys saying, well, you just need to try harder, or like I'm successful, so I must have tried really hard. And somehow this guy is just whining and blaming his problems on some like systemic.
I found the reactions to be sort of like threefold. There are people on the hard right who are like angry that I'm not like, and this has been going on since 1970, and white men need to take back America type thing.
Right.
Then there are the people, then there's sort of the centrist people who are like, this is great. There are people on the left who live on blue sky who just will insist that actually none of this has ever happened. But I find sort of sociologically interesting is the liberal left who do exist in reality and can acknowledge that the statistics in the piece and my personal experience are real, but who find it's almost they have more of an aesthetic objection to what I'm saying than like a political one. Like, yes, this happened, but the fact that you're complaining about it is and should remain a faux pas. And I'm not. Yeah, I'm trying. I've been trying to sort of unpack what that objection is, and it seems entirely to me aesthetic.
Yeah, no, I think I follow you. Like, it's just this is kind of the code of ethics. Like, you violated the first rule of Fight Club is don't talk about Fight Club kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. It's like gauche to even like mention that you could possibly have, and this is very to me this is very like 2020 thinking. Like, okay, like so I did, but like isn't the world going to be better off if we don't keep doing this?
Right.
But I think they sort of believe that it would all sort of magically heal on its own if no one talked about it ever.
Yeah.
Even though personally they understand that it existed and wasn't optimal.
So, because to me, like the whole point of writing, especially nonfiction, this form, is to say something that kind of everybody knows is true, but is afraid to say out loud. I mean, that's been like the kind of controlling principle of my career, and I have found it fruitful. Like, people appreciate that. Like, the job of the writer is to like not necessarily solve the problem, but state it clearly, right? I think that was Chekhov or somebody. But are they just sort of like, you're making us look bad, like you're being a whiner, and this is like going to rub off on us?
I think there's still an impulse to be like the good white guy. Like, I'm still like the good ally, and like if you complain about this stuff, you're not a good ally. So I think behind that, there's a little bit of that impulse. And I think that there's just like, again, and part of it is like, I got mine, but some of these guys who like I've noticed on Substack who are complaining about it, like haven't got theirs. And they're still objecting on like a sort of, not on a reality-based objection or, an argument, or, they'll say it's not quite as bad as he makes it out to be, but, isn't it still valuable to get this in the public record in some way and to get people to acknowledge it? But it seems like a sort of aesthetic problem with mentioning this out loud. And I think part of why the article struck was because people, I guess, are finally ready to hear it. And one of the critiques on the right that I saw that I appreciated was that, like, they all knew that this was happening for a decade. They've been complaining about it for a decade. Why now does it hit? And there was like an analogy, like a sort of Soviet glasnost analogy, where like we all knew this was happening. Why does it suddenly matter because you assembled these statistics? And I do find that question interesting. Like, why did it suddenly occur to people that this thing that they knew was happening for a decade, some would say that it was good, some would say that it was bad, but why is it suddenly okay to talk about it?
Why do you think it's okay to talk about it?
I think that the institutions probably have lost enough legitimacy over the last decade. I think that's part of it. I think part of it is that it's not quite as proactively going on. So the people, with a vested interest in saying it's not happening have less of an interest in that and less of the capacity to say that it's not happening. But honestly, like in the end, I'm not really sure why right now, and like I'm not sure. Like if I hadn't written this article, I do wonder, like, when would this article have been written by someone else? I guess.
I mean, it might have been written, maybe it already has been written by some like very red-pilled, manosphere inflected person for a conservative publication. I mean, I think part of it is like compact. At least right now, people don't. It's sort of neither fish nor fowl. Like people are not familiar enough with it to go in with some preconceived notion. At least I think a lot of people are sort of meeting it for the first time. I mean, in fact, my understanding is that you had written this for the Atlantic or pitched it to the Atlantic or had some kind of relationship with the Atlantic about the piece, and they didn't want to do it in the end.
Yeah, I had worked with a friend of mine who's an editor at the Atlantic, and we kind of pitched it, and they were interested, but basically wanted it to only be about my own experience in Hollywood. I mean, not that they would guarantee. It's not like they basically were like, you can do it. We'll probably print it if it's like that. We're not going to guarantee anything. And my point of view at the time was that my dream at this point, I'm 40 years old. Like I'm a washed out screenwriter. I'm not 25. It's like not like the byline in the Atlantic is the thing that will like get me up in the morning. Great. Like, like I published an article in the Atlantic. What now? Who cares?
That's your green juice.
Yeah.
That's your cold plunge.
Yeah.
That'll get you up.
It's like if I was 22 and they were like, you need to compromise completely on all this stuff and like you're going to have a byline. I'll be like, great. But like, I don't know.
Yeah.
Like I want to write the article I want to write. And I think the article that you're suggesting that I write is cute. It's sort of here's a white guy who's honest about his resentments, which is like fine, And
I think that would have been a disaster, actually.
Yeah, I'm fine with the joke being on me. The point of the piece in the end is like the joke is a little bit on me, in that like I it can be about me. People can say like, look at him, he's not quite, as good as he thinks he is or should have been. But if that's the whole piece, then that's all anyone needs to take away from it. And what they need to take away from it, in my point of view, is something more broad and meaningful than my own failure. Like, anyone, a zillion people have written about like going to Hollywood and flaming out. That's not the point.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm curious about the end because you do, the piece is really powerful and you're very clear with I'm not going to say grievance, with your argument, but then there's a capitulation. Like at the end you say, well, my mistake was thinking that I deserved these things. Like, thinking that like a relatively, having anything other than an extraordinary level of talent would be enough. And I mean, it's curious because you refer to yourself as ordinary. And I noticed in at least one of the discussions, it was the one with John Gantz, Max Reed, and Jay Caspian King. And I'm a little bit confused as to whose podcast it was, but it was the three of those guys. One of them was sort of quoting back, I think it was Max, and he substituted the word mediocre for ordinary.
Interesting.
I think our friend Daniel Oppenheimer pointed this out when he was talking about the podcast. And that was a real tell, I think, that slip of the tongue or just misremembering.
Yeah, I think mediocre white men was like the slur of the 2010s.
It was like a t-shirt slogan.
No, and I think the end of the piece, it's not meant like, it's not like a don't look back in anger. Like, of course I'm I'm kind of angry about it, but we all have to live the lives that we live and we have to go on. And I do think that I do in retrospect primarily, it's not like I could have fought the system in 2016 and won, you know? I do think in retrospect, I should have taken the writing on the wall and figured out like a better career to have, you know, because it wasn't going to happen. And my wife has told, you know, who basically was since 2019 has been like, this is silly. Like at this point, like, you know, no one, you know, it's not that you're bad, but it's like, you know, you can get some traction and then nothing happens and nothing will happen because this is the way that, you know, things are. And, you know, I regret not like selling out hard in 2015 and working in tech. Like, why not, you know?
And was your wife saying this is not happening because of this? Like, was she actually able to spell it out?
Yeah, sure. We talked about it, you know, and it's.
And were you saying, oh, no, that can't be true. I can't believe it. Or like, I can crack it.
No. The whole thing the whole time is, you know, it's happening, but you think you're going to be one of the lucky few. And the thing about the lucky few is very few people get to be that person. I used in the article an example was Dan Erickson, the creator of Severance, which is, in my opinion, is one of the best shows of the last decade. And he sold the pilot in 2016 and didn't work as a staff writer until his own show's writer's room started up in like 2020 or something. And that guy is obviously a talent, you know, and the idea that he could not pay the bills from writing, you know, even after having cracked it with Severance, with the pilot, I think speaks to just like how complete the shutout was.
Going back to the conversation with John, Max, and Jay, you know, another thing that was frustrating, and I saw this, it wasn't just them, this was like a very typical response, was like, okay, this happened, but it's over now. It's over now, so let's just like accept that there's some collateral damage and move on. But the problem with that is that, well, A, it's not really over, and B, it's ignoring the permanent downstream effects. Like, you know, you've got this entire very large group of people, of men, who have been like cut off at the pass, and it's contributing to all kinds of maladaptive behaviors, and like this, people are not, I mean, I don't know. And I, you know, getting back to my earlier question, like, why do you think now is the time for this conversation? I wonder if part of it is because we're talking about masculinity crisis and mental health, and nobody's getting married and nobody's having sex and like nobody's asking anybody out on a date and all this stuff. Like, do you think that like that this sort of can be slotted into that larger conversation?
I think it can be. And I think a lot of that stuff is also cultural, which is that, you know, for 10 years, white men were, you know, constantly used as like the butt of every, you know, employment joke. And, you know, on the one hand, who cares? But also on the other hand, like for a decade, if you hear that and you're, you know, younger than I am, or, you know, you at a certain point, you start saying like, why should I participate in this stuff? I mean, it's a little beyond the scope of the article, but of course this stuff is related, you know, it's all related to the sort of same central, like, we shouldn't spend, you know, our public time vilifying anyone or like based on immutable characteristics. And, you know, the crisis, you know, it is weird that in all of the talk of this crisis of masculinity, and that, you know, all the mainstream liberal outlets have run pieces on, it has never occurred to them to sort of ask like, well, like, why did all these men stop like working in these fields in these years? Like, who were my coworkers? Like, you know, I just watched the New Yorker documentary last night, which I actually liked more than I thought that I would. But you see David Remnick and all these old white guys surrounded by like a sea of women, and
just like, the way they want it.
It worked out great for, you know, like.
I mean, by accident. Yes, it was. It's in the end. Yeah.
Like the boomers, like, you know, they're in happy, you know, these like, you know, lecherous 70-year-old men get to be around like 25-year-old women for the rest of their lives, and that's great. Was your previous point? Oh, about it still happening. I think it still is happening in all these industries, just at like a slightly lower temperature than it was like a couple of years ago. And, you know, I posted on my Substack, there was like a, you know, assistant professor position at Mount Holyoke in creative writing
I saw
that
that.
basically did everything it could to say, like, white men need not apply. And, it's fine if Mount Holyoke hires like a non-white man to teach this creative writing class. But the idea that you need to sort of assert that several times in like a paragraph long job posting is wild, and there's still, and I really do think that short of a couple of very high profile EEOC lawsuits, academia will continue to do this. Like it seems, I think Hollywood can kind of course correct in a faster way, maybe media a little bit, but it seems like academia is going to dig in on the trenches unless the administration really goes after them.
Right. Well, I mean, they're the last holdout, right? I mean, they're just kind of off in their own thing. They're the blue sky of professions.
Yeah,
Um,
literally.
Yeah. Well, I mean, another thing that happened, and you don't actually touch on this directly in your piece, but this is something that I've talked about a lot with people. You had this influx of, every intern has got to be a person of color and like all this, junior level staff. And so what you have are these like terrible optics where you've got all these like middle-aged white people in management positions and all these like young people of color, marginalized background people in junior level positions. And then it really does kind of look like an apartheid state or something. Like the white people are still in charge because they're older and they are more senior. And I can't tell you how many workplaces I've heard described, like the lower level people like start rebelling because they're interpreting every kind of, somebody asking a boss asking somebody to do something as a racial microaggression, when it's not at all. I mean, it's just like a complete just design flaw of this whole DEI project, it seems.
Yeah, and I think that it doesn't seem like anyone ever sort of conceptually thought this through, like
Right.
it just sort of like took hold. And, personally, I think like affirmative action makes sense in a country that's 80% white with like a 10% black population that has like a legitimate historical grievance that is very real. It doesn't work in a country that's 55, 60%. It doesn't work once you expand that
Yeah.
And I will say, like, I think that something flipped between affirmative action and DEI, where affirmative action was like a sort of quota for a small group of people, whereas DEI became a quota for the majority. There's no quota anymore for all these other groups, but there is now a quota for white men, like at the lower levels. It sort of conceptually flipped from like, okay, we're going to reserve a certain number of spots to make sure that we're not like completely, whitewashed, to something that was the exact opposite, where like, someone, the white guy is like now the token in all of these roles.
Right. I'm curious, like, how many gay men you spoke with, or like just sort of I guess, yeah. I mean, let's not get into the trans thing, but I had a couple conversations with friends who are gay, talking about, and these were writers, like talking about how they had been discriminated against. I mean, these are people who've been in the business 30 years for a long time. Like, okay, we can only have one gay guy in this writer's room. We need a straight guy to write this, like straight part. And then all of a sudden they go, discriminated against homophobia or whatever for a long time. And then all of a sudden he wasn't hireable because he was a white guy.
Yeah. No, they had, it's like, well, I heard that about like, there's an anecdote, like a showrunner, like a female showrunner said, we had like 4 years of being like a white female showrunner of like, being like same, I mean, sort of similar to like a gay man. We had like 4 years of everything being like in our favor. And then, we got overturned ourselves, which, I mean, the revolution always eats itself. But
of course,
I did speak to a couple of gay men who felt this like primarily in, I think they generally felt as if they assumed that this regime would be like friendlier to them than it ended up being.
Yeah. Well, Right. And then this queer identity emerged. So I get, the second part of what I was about to say is like, it wasn't enough to just be gay. You had to be queer. You had to be like somehow like
You had to be extra special. Gay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then, I think Thomas Chatterton Williams wrote a piece in the Atlantic, I believe, pointing out that, it's not just, it's actually not enough to just be a person of color to get these advantages. You have to be a person of color with the right opinions, right? So
I think I spoke to like a friend of mine who's like a Black woman screenwriter who got a lot of like jobs, but she made it what I think is like a completely valid point, and someone who's not me should write this article, but that being like a talented person of color or woman who's like forced to write these like narratives that you just want to write good stuff. You don't want to be slotted into, I'm going to be writing about like Black suffering in this way or that way. You want to be able to be creatively fulfilled. And I think that this regime led to like a lot of that form of stereotyping. Like it's not my place to sort of explore that. I also think separately, like DEI, and again, this is not my place to like write this article, but I think DEI was bad for the sort of Black American experience because you turned what was like a very specific grievance and a very specific history into this completely amorphous thing about like the privilege of like this other group. And I'm not sure that like underprivileged descendant of American slaves has much in common with like the second generation, Brahmin daughter of like two doctors, and the idea that they have the same historical grievances or the same, this is not the piece that I can't write that piece, but someone should write that piece.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's actually racist. Like that is racism. I mean, and the other thing is, and I've heard this from people in Hollywood, like by elevating people with really no talent or ability because of like some identity characteristic, you're setting them up to fail. And then that's just like not helping anybody. It's and I have heard this continually. You have a lot of people who really don't have the competence to be doing their jobs, and they've been put in them, and then it just looks bad, and you've got a bad product.
Yeah, and again, you can't say that this is like a direct result, but I think like would Hollywood be in a better position if they had just made more good things for the last decade? Like, of course they would be, and some of that is structural. People on the left would love to talk about how it's all because of tech and all because of like different things. And I do agree that in Hollywood's case, like what happened is you had, you used to have like a small production company, you would have a movie or two, you'd have a TV show, everything that had to be good. Maybe it wasn't always good, but for your business to succeed, like you needed those things to work. When you have something like Netflix or Apple or Amazon, what matters much more than the success of any project is negative PR. And, like negative PR is worth, minus 10 billion in a stock price, whereas like you can throw a couple $100 million at a show that is going to be bad. So there is some structural critique to be made, but I don't think that really changes the moral calculus of whether like discriminating against a group of people for their immutable characteristics was a good thing.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing people seem to always forget is that, these professions, especially publishing, let's go back to New York here, like these are low paying, high prestige careers. Like, if you're going to work in publishing, you need to have enough independent wealth to do that. Like those professions those fields are not attracting like first generation college students. Like there's not a lot of people of color. There's certainly not a lot of like, white people from Appalachia coming into those jobs because they don't pay enough. Like these are like people with trust funds. And so the idea that you can kind of socially engineer some like magical, like, rainbow coalition into like Condé Nast or a publishing company it's absurd,
I mean, also like all these publications sort of decided that the demographics that they needed to appeal to were actually like, New York City, the New York Times like demographic that they, is not the exact demographics of New York City. It's primarily like rich white people who live in New York City.
Right.
So like, are you appealing to all of New York City? The idea that like, should 20% of your staff be undocumented workers? Like this stuff just doesn't make sense. Like on any like real level, once you dig in past whatever the sort of superficial talking point is.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to, I want to let you go pretty soon, but I do want to talk just briefly about your piece last spring about the literary world and book publishing and white men getting their novels published or publishing in the New Yorker. You had some statistics there too. What was the response there? It didn't make quite a splash, but it made certainly a ripple.
That made a splash, and honestly, in some weird way, I think I got more legitimate pushback on that piece. People were like, no, it's not happening. The novels actually that the white men are writing are bad. And I'm like, the whole point of the piece is that the novels that the white men are writing are bad. But I think, I don't know why, but I felt like that piece got some more legitimate pushback from some quarters, people that engaged with it and were like, no, you're missing the forest through the trees here. What I still find most interesting about that piece that I wrote is the argument that I made, which wasn't that this was just like simply a question of, demographic wokeness, but that like white men or white male novelists who, were self-selected to succeed had sort of taken on this identity that neutered their writing of any like sharpness or capacity to thrill. And, if you look at these books I went through a lot of these books and they either go like historical in a way, which is so I can completely avoid like even obliquely talking about like the present moment and being a bad white guy, or they talk about, or they're so contained that like the outside world doesn't intrude. But, in the end, I sort of came to like, if you can't describe the conversation you had with your agent like yesterday, like what hope is there for you to be able to describe the world that like is around you,
Yeah.
And
it's a loss. It's an artistic loss. I mean, I was thinking about this, for me, like reading those post 60s and I guess into the early 2000s novels by white men taught me about men, like Philip Roth and Updike and Richard Ford and Jonathan Franzen. I mean, even like John Irving, like they got inside the heads of men in a way that I never would have understood otherwise and conveyed a sense of desperation and, how, for instance, like womanizing is a form of buffoonery, right? And it was really formative for me. Like reading Philip Roth, stuff that would never be published today, not allowable. Like those characters were, yes, they were like horrible and everything, but like they were so instructive, and so necessary, I think, for my development as a person and as a woman who needs to relate to men. And to lose that is a shame, to say the least.
Yeah. I mean, fiction is about like feeling the interiority of someone else's mind in some way. And, reading like female authors is good, but also you can't have like an art that completely papers over all these things that have occurred in the larger culture. And, I think I sort of just got the feeling that all these like white male writers were like primarily trying to impress their woke professor at like the Iowa Writers Workshop in like 2013, like in whatever they could write that would make their the rest of their cohort not angry and say like, what a beautiful piece of writing. And, the point of that kind of writing isn't to be polite, isn't to, the point is to ruffle feathers. And I think for a decade, in many ways, like white men tried as hard as they could not to like, rock the boat, to sit it out. And I think it was in the end a mistake and bad.
Do you think there's any evidence that great art has been produced that wouldn't have been produced otherwise because these gates have been opened for certain people?
I'm trying to think of like a great, what are the best movies of the last decade? I mean, the truth is, like, art as a whole, like from both white men and non-white men, like has sort of become less and less relevant, I think, or mainstream art. Um, I'm sure there are a couple, and I think that that's great, but I don't know if like it's been worth the wages of what hasn't gotten made or what could have been made. I mean, there's no telling with the counterfactual. I don't want to sort of get in hot water by saying like, oh, all of the, everything would have been great. It might have just also been terrible. But I do think that like we've missed out on like an art, like from all angles and not just from white men, that like grapples with the world as it exists,
Yeah.
around you. I remember like a couple years ago, for the first time, for like 5 years, anytime you saw like a black woman in like a mainstream like movie or TV show, you knew she couldn't be the villain. And this was like bad.
Right.
Like as soon as you saw her, like you're like, okay, like she's actually a good guy. Like, which
they say that in the video games too, right?
Yeah, which like from like a narrative perspective, like ruins things. And like I remember a couple years ago, like there was like I don't even remember what it was, but I watched something and like the black woman was revealed to be a villain. I was like, God, like okay, like we're coming back. And whenever things get telegraphed like that, it's just bad.
Yeah, I mean, and I am going to let you go soon. I just, Matt Walsh, everybody reacted to this piece, so, Matt Walsh, this is an example of what happens with like, if the smart, thoughtful people don't talk about this stuff, the stupid, less thoughtful people will. I mean, he says white men are responsible for all innovations, airplanes, spaceships, trains, phones, light bulbs, computer. His criticism of your piece was that you omit the fact that when you discriminate against white men, every part of society gets worse. And he says that no shows with female creators or majority women writing staffs have ever been good. And I'm like, okay, like depends on your taste, I guess. But
I mean, Girls is great.
Brilliant. I mean, Girls, Fleabag, Crazy
Fleabag
Ex-Girlfriend.
is also great.
I mean,
but also notice Girls and Fleabag were from like from the before time.
That's true. You're right. And Girls is like a secretly conservative show. I'm one of the people who's
also what I'll say is like I recently rewatched Girls with my wife, and there's something so poignant about watching these characters like before the fall. Like it's like before the wokeness is going to hit all of them in these ways that are going to be catastrophic for all.
Oh, the characters themselves, you mean?
Yeah, like you see like Adam, like what will become of Adam in the late 2010s. Like it's not going to be good.
Oh my God, that would be a great sequel. Like that's like the Better Call Saul of Girls. It's like what happened to Adam. He has to go in the witness protection program or something.
Yeah. So there's something very poignant about like watching. It was like the last moment that I felt that sort of optimism about the world around me. And I think that would have been true for the characters in Girls as well. And you could sense that in them when they were,
That's fascinating. Well, I want to ask you just a few more questions, and one of them came from somebody, a listener, and I don't know. You talk about these what you should have done otherwise, and you talk about crypto and podcasting and Substack as refuges for these shut out white men. And this person says, but those fields also attracted people for positive reasons: technological novelty, creative freedom, better economics. How do you distinguish between fleeing from versus running toward? I mean, maybe these guys were just like, there's more money to be made in crypto than from Netflix. So
I think that's, I mean, I'm sure that's true to some extent. I guess I would say, I think for some people they fled, and for some people they were attracted by it. And it was like everything, there's a push pull. And, I'm not saying that these were like exclusively like refuges for like the refuse of these other industries, but, they were clearly open to all comers in a way that, these other industries were not.
Right. I mean, and there's also the fact that like there was just a broader business model collapse while this was going on. So it's hard to It's sometimes hard.
It's hard. It's hard. Yeah, it's hard to know like why any specific decision was made by any specific person. In aggregate, I'm sure a lot of people graduated college and were like techno utopians and went into crypto. I'm also, I know one of them. Know people who just like couldn't get jobs and found jobs in crypto, or just held their Bitcoin from 2014.
So what do you do now? You say that you scalp tickets. Really?
Most of my 95% of my income comes from scalping tickets on the internet. Sorry, and I have a couple.
That's okay. No, I know. I'm gonna let you go. Obviously, wow.
Basically, it's not like an industrial. I don't do like Taylor Swift. I don't have bots. The business model is pretty simple. If something has sold out at like a medium-sized venue in New York, it might not have sold out in Chicago or LA yet, and you buy a bunch of tickets there. And it sucks, but it's like a way to, earn a decent living.
But you really couldn't get another job? Like, you could get a job selling Toyotas or something?
The thing is, I could have. Like, the thing is, like, scalping tickets, like, pays more than most entry-level jobs. So I was just describing this to a friend of mine today, which is that, if I was making a ton of money scalping tickets, I would be thrilled and like, who cares? Like, I'll just do that. It's soul-sucking for 30 hours a week, but like, I'm crushing it, so who cares? Or if I was making like less money, I would be like, okay, I need to go start at the bottom somewhere and work my way up. But I'm sort of in a sweet spot where, I can still pursue other interests, as, people have seen from the article, and, provide a good enough life for my family. So it's hard to say, like, I'm just going to stop doing this thing.
And you still do live in LA, we should say.
I do live in LA. I live among the Armenians in Glendale.
Well, so what do you wish you would have done when you were younger? What would you tell your younger self if you could talk to that person, senior at Princeton?
I would have told him to go become a lawyer.
But wouldn't you have had the same problems?
I think that I would have gotten out of law school in time to like have made it. There wouldn't have been like a sort of 4-year. I think the thing is also, if I had gone straight to Hollywood in 2006, I probably would have been able to get in.
Right, that was a great time.
And like the truth is, like, I'm happy with my life like 90% of the time, and I love my family and have a pretty good life. So, I wish that for everyone in America, white men and non-white men. I just hope like going forward, we can acknowledge that this thing happened and stop doing it. And the downstream effects are sort of baked in at this point. I'm not sure how people get like a decade of their lives back or their professional careers. Like, I really don't have any positive advice in that respect. But, I think going forward, the way that we can make society work is not to discriminate based on any immutable characteristics.
Well, thank you for writing the piece. Congratulations. And I hope you can at least enjoy the attention. I know it must be very uncomfortable, but there's some satisfaction that people really.
It's a strange ride.
You're doing what, you're doing your job.
See.
You're doing your job as a writer. You got people thinking and talking and made uncomfortable, but that's why we do this. So I'm glad you did it. And thank you so much for speaking with me.
Thanks for having me, Meghan.